Hey everybody, we're going to look at Meteor Application Template React. In particular, we're going to look up at the startup sequence and how data is initialized in the system. So remember when you do, for the first time, when you run Meteor npm start, you see a bunch of stuff happen that, doesn't seem that interesting. But then something doesn't happen that's interesting. Come on, not interesting yet, not interesting yet. There we go. Now it's going to be interesting. So we started up the MongoDB server and we see these lines of output that we're creating default users and creating default data. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. What's even more interesting is that now, if I quit the system and I run this again, what we're going to notice, second time through, is that we don't get those initialization messages. Okay, so somehow we have some default data, somehow we get that default data defined when the system starts up for the first time, for whatever that means, first time, but then we don't have that being done every single time. Okay, so the goal of this video is to kind of walk you through the code that does this initialization stuff. All right, so to get there, what we might want to do first is actually just go to localhost 3000 and let's log in. Let's log in as the admin user because that's kind of the most. Okay, so if we look at the admin user, we'll see that the admin user has a couple items, stuff items associated with them, and we can actually see that these two lines correspond to those two lines. But then if we go to the admin user interface where it displays all the data, we can see that there are actually four things that were defined right here. Okay, and then we got to log in as an admin at foo.com, so there was a user that was defined for that, and there's this other user called John, which I won't log in as, but trust me, the guy's there. All right, so let's now switch to the code and talk about how this happens. All right, so there are a couple special directories in a Meteor application, top-level directories, one called server, one called client. And inside both of those are JavaScript files called main.js. You can change this, by the way, but by default, which is a very reasonable default, you have these two directories called client and server. You have a file in there called main.js. And so when the client starts up, i.e. a browser, you're going to, Meteor knows to run that JavaScript file, okay, in order to get the client set up. But in this case, it's the server that we're interested in because when we look at this output, this is data that's coming from the server, right? We're not looking inside a browser at this stuff. This is at the console. So this is all activity that's occurring on the server side. So the way to know how that actually happens is simply go into the server directory, click on main.js, and it turns out we have these three lines of code which are all imported, which means this code is actually run at startup time. Okay, so let's go to the import startup server accounts. So if we go in here, and by the way, it turns out that there's kind of a convention in Meteor that you have your startup import, startup stuff in this directory, but those kind of best practice is you just put imports into files in the imports directory, and basically 99.9% of your code lives in this imports directory, and just a little bit of startup stuff lives outside. And the reason for that is because it turns out that Meteor implements, what's it called, Isomorphic Javascript, I think. So there is code, particularly in this API directory, which runs on both the client and server side, okay, which is kind of a cool idea when you think about it. And so that would be a problem, right? If there's some code that is used on both sides, then you can't simply say all the client code goes within the client directory and all the server code goes within the server directory, because it ain't that simple. All right. So their solution is to say, all right, we could have some in the client, some in the server, and the shared in someplace else, but let's not do that. So the best practice in this particular community is to say minimize the stuff in the client and server directories, put everything you can in the imports directory, and then there's this kind of centralized repository. Everybody can import what they want. It turns out to be a pretty decent way to go. So we're going to have inside the imports directory a startup directory. That's where we put our code that helps us start up either the client or the server. Okay, so for the client side, every time a browser connects, the code inside that client startup side is going to be run. That whenever the server comes up for a given app, given system, the code in here is going to run. So let's just go through this. So we're going to start off with accounts. This is the code that's going to run. Okay, and it's pretty easy code to understand. Basically, what's going to happen is that we're going to define a function called create user, and then we're going to have this conditional that says if Meteor users find count equals 0. Okay, and so the basic logic here is if there's no users, let's define some users. Okay, and so then the second time that we run this thing, there will be some users and we won't execute the code. Okay, so there's basically, and you could be checking for all sorts of different properties of the database. Picking users, it's a reasonable thing to do, but you could have picked something else as long as you can kind of guarantee that that property will be, true the first time you're running the system and then false, after you've done whatever you want to do the first time you're running the system. So in this case, we're going to check to see that the users are equal to 0. If that's true, then we assume this is the first time we're running the database and we want to do some default account initialization. So then there's this second line, meteor.settings.default accounts. Okay, what the heck is that? Well, turns out that in Meteor, you can specify a settings file, which then is bound to this meteor.settings object, okay, when you actually run the code. So you've got access within your running system on the server side, by the way, to stuff in this settings file, all right? And where is the settings file? Well, if we go and look in our start script, because remember, whenever we start up the system, we do this thing, Meteor npm run start, okay? So what that's saying is we're going to invoke Meteor, but then we're going to tell Meteor what we're actually going to do is run the npm start script, okay? So it kind of passes off control to npm, which is going to load the package.json, which is going to say, I need to find a script called start. Here it is, okay? And so the start script says Meteor, no release check. That's a little flag because Meteor, phones home to see if there's a new release, and that takes a little bit of time. And if you've got a bad internet connection, it's a drag. So I just disable that release check property when I'm doing development. We're going to exclude these legacy web browsers in Cordova because that makes the build run faster. And then we have this property, the one that we're interested in, called --settings, and then we give a path to a file which will be bound to that settings variable. So if we go into config settings.development.json, oh, here we go. Here is a JSON file which has two fields, default accounts and default data. This looks suspiciously like, what you've been seeing. Plus, it shows you, these two users, even shows you their passwords. Now, providing passwords in clear text, total no-no, right? You don't want to do that. However, and you won't do that in production, okay, for sure. So Meteor has very well developed, very secure authentication stuff built in, which is a really nice feature of Meteor that you don't have to do this stuff. And in ICS 4.14, you'll go into probably more detail on kind of industrial strength password authentication. In fact, in systems like RadGrad, which is a Meteor application used at UH, we actually use the UH authentication system. So you get that standard, CAS authentication dialog when it comes up. And Meteor never sees your passwords, and my system never sees your passwords. all it does is find out that you are, who you say you are. So, but during development, okay, turns out it's nice to use a different built-in system and to know what the password is. Okay, so this never survives into production, but during development, you want to be able to log in as users, and so you want to have a kind of a convenient way to specify passwords and so forth. Also, we have this ability to define roles in Meteor. There's a package called a landing roles, which is really nice because that enables you to define a user with a given role and then check that role when deciding what pages to display and what kinds of operations are available to that particular user. So our admin user can do things that regular users can't do. For example, our admin user can see the stuff of all users, and regular users can only see the stuff, the items that they've actually developed. Anyway, here we are in settings.development.json, and all that to say, kind of getting back to why I'm even talking about this, is because we want to see if in the settings object, which is going to be basically identically equal to this thing, is there a default accounts field? Yes. Okay, there it is. So that's just a little bit of checking to make sure we didn't make a typo or anything. And then if that's true, we say we're creating the default users, and then we're going to map over that default accounts field, which is this list right here, or array. List, array, same thing. In this case, we're going to map over them, and we're going to use this destructuring parameter assignment. So instead of actually passing in that object, right, we could, when we map over each element. So the map is actually going to be passed this entire object. And so we can do this beautiful JavaScript syntactic sugar to say, look, I don't want to have to pass in an object and then extract all the keywords. I just want those to be variables within the body of my my function. And so I'm going to get the email, password, and role out of the object that's passed, and then I'm going to call create user with the email, password, and role. Here's my function to create the user, and it goes ahead and calls this internal function accounts.create, this internal function called create user of the accounts class object. Not sure what that thing actually is. Anyway, the internal accounts package has a create user function that can be called, and then if we find out that the role was the admin, we then create a role called admin, and we only do that if it hasn't been defined before. That way we can add as many admin users as we want. We don't have any frustrations. And then we call this thing to set up the role for the user. That user is being the admin user. So this code corresponds to these lines right here. And you can go over this by yourself and kind of see that they correspond. All right, so that was the first thing we did in server main.js. Let's go to publications. Second thing we're going to do, okay? So publications, I'm going to get to this later, actually, but just to note that during the startup sequence, every single time we will load the value of the accounts package, then we load this publications package, and this is going to do this strange thing called publish, all right? And we will get to that in a later screencast, but I'm just going to note, publications.js is going to be loaded during the startup sequence. Then we'll go to Mongo. The third thing we're going to do in main.js is we're going to load this file, Mongo, which is this file. And actually, this is going to turn out to be pretty much just the same as the accounts.js. Okay, so we're going to do a check to see, are there any things in the stuffs collection, which is that's going to be, there won't be anything the first time we run this initialization code, but if everything goes correctly, second time we run it, there will be stuff in there, so we won't run the body of this. Then we do just kind of a hygiene check to make sure there's a default data attached to this settings object, and if you actually specified the settings property when you invoked Meteor to actually load this thing. then there will be this default data package. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, well, why the heck, would you ever not have the default data? And the answer to that is that there is another way to run Meteor. So instead of saying Meteor npm run start, you could just type Meteor, okay, and then the system starts up. But since you're not running that script, you're not running the start script, you're not supplying typically the minus settings parameter if you just type Meteor. So in that case, so this is added in as a way of kind of dealing with the situation where someone just types Meteor, doesn't type Meteor npm run start, and therefore there's no settings file, which means meteor.settings is bound to nothing, which means meteor.settings.default data. I don't even know. But you know what? Let's find out. Okay, let's find out what happens. So we're going to do a Meteor reset. So that gets rid of the data in the database. And then let's just type Meteor, see what happens. I think that'll be kind of a fun experiment. So now there's no settings file. And the question is Meteor.settings undefined, or is it, kind of initialized to some, an empty object? That's what I don't actually know. Okay, cannot initialize the database. Please invoke Meteor with a settings file. So that's a very informative error message, and that comes from up here. Okay. So in this case, users was 0, but we could not find the default accounts property. So settings is so Meteor.settings is always defined clearly, but so that you can actually check Meteor.settings.default accounts and see that property's not there. That's obviously, for a variety of reasons, makes sense that they would do it that way. Okay. But in this case, anyway, we, what do? We Control C, and then we do it the right way, and then things get initialized correctly. Anyway, so we go through the same thing. If there's no default data, if there is a default data field, which there should be if we've run Meteor, invoked Meteor the correct way, then we're going to map through the default data array. We're going to pass that object to add data. And in this case, we call the insert operation with this object. No need to destructure it because the insert takes a object with two fields anyway. All right, so let me see. That is it. Let's just check because it's fun to make sure nothing bad happened. No, nothing bad happened. So we've got our system running again. So now you should know how it is that a Meteor application starts up, at least on the server side, and how data is initialized.